public opinion and representatives, and so far they have been dominant, the corporatists, but they're beginning to lose, and we have enough historical evidence to show that the tide is running against them. For example, on the minimum wage fight, that comes in 70–80% in the polls, which means a lot of conservative Walmart workers think they should get a restored minimum wage, at least to what it was 46 years ago, plus inflation adjustment. That would be almost $11 an hour. It's the left-right alliance is coming through at the state legislative level on juvenile justice reform and addressing the whole problem of prisons in our country. Newt Gingrich and others have started a group called Right on Crime, and the progressive forces are working hand in glove with right and left state legislatures, and they've gotten through some bills in over a dozen legislatures. The third area where it's breaking through, the left-right alliance, is to block the further expansion of these globalized trade agreements. The Pacific Trade Agreement, which is being negotiated with Asian countries by President Obama, is now going to be blocked under an opposition in the House of Representatives to fast track. In other words, Republicans and Democrats, I think, have about a majority of the House, even defying their leadership in the Democratic and Republican Party, Boehner and Pelosi. They have enough votes right now to block a fast-track zip through the House trade agreement. And that's the left-right. A little over a year ago, there was almost a majority vote in the House to block the NSA from dragnet surveillance. That was a bubbling up of public opinion going from the grassroots all the way to the House of Representatives in defiance of Speaker Boehner and Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi. So we're seeing this emerge, and if we really want to get things done in this country, long overdue redirections, then we better pay attention to this emerging left-right alliance that I described in detail. There are 25 areas of left-right convergence in this country, and they represent a majority. That's why I called the book Unstoppable. And all we need now is to start the conversation level locally, have it bubble up into the media. The media sort of likes this idea of unlikely allies, especially at the local level, and have it move into the political stream, and then put it on the table, all these issues for the electoral campaigns that are coming up.
Ralph Nader, I want to go to this global issue of the TPP, because over the weekend, President Obama spoke to young leaders during this town hall-style meeting at the University of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. His talk was briefly disrupted by peaceful protesters holding up signs denouncing a sweeping new trade deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, often referred to by critics as NAFTA on steroids, as you were talking about establishing a free trade zone that would stretch from Vietnam to Chile, encompass 800 million people, about a third of world trade, nearly 40% of the global economy. Obama defended the TPP.
The trade agreement that we're trying to create, the TPP, part of what we're trying to do is to create higher standards for labor protection, higher standards for environmental protection, more consistent protection of intellectual property, because increasingly that's the next phase of wealth. All those things require more transparency and more accountability and more rule of law. And I think that it's entirely consistent with Malaysia moving into the next phase.
That's President Obama in Malaysia. Who is advising President Obama on TPP? The unions, environmental organizations? Ralph Nader.
Well, they can't get back through the secrecy of these negotiations and these drafts. As Lori Wallach of Global Trade Watch has pointed out repeatedly, even members of Congress couldn't get the draft negotiations from the TPP. Although the corporate lobbyists have access to these drafts, but it's quite clear that the TPP is nothing more than an extension of NAFTA and the World Trade Organization on steroids. And here's where we have a left-right alliance, each one with their reason. on the left, they're opposed to these agreements because they're bad for workers, they're bad for the price of medicines being affordable under the intellectual property rules that are being negotiated, they're bad for open government, and they're bad for the environment. On the right, they don't like these trade agreements because they shred our sovereignty. I happen to agree with that too. All international treaties reduce sovereignties by definition. But this one, these trade agreements are the greatest usurpers of local, state, and national sovereignty in American history. And so we have this growing alliance. And by the way, it goes back to documents like the 2002 Texas Republican state platform that was dead set against these trade agreements on sovereignty issues. So I don't think President Obama is reflecting his campaign assurances in 2008 when he said he was going to work to revise NAFTA and WTO for better environmental, labor, and consumer protections. He hasn't done that for WTO or NAFTA, and he's not doing it for this Trans-Pacific trade agreement.
Speaking of the power of corporations, General Motors is asking a court to shield it from legal liability for all conduct predating its 2009 bankruptcy. The motion was filed earlier this month that seeks recognition of the split from old GM into the post-bankruptcy new GM. If approved, GM's request could protect it from claims over the defective ignition switch linked to at least 13, maybe hundreds of deaths. General Motors knew of the defect for over a decade, of course, but only issued a recall earlier this year. The company's request was disclosed in a federal lawsuit filed in Texas over the defect. In its court motion, GM says, quote, just like the other ignition switch actions that other plaintiffs have filed in the wake of public reports regarding the outstanding recall, this case relates to a vehicle designed, manufactured, originally sold, and advertised by old GM, unquote. Meanwhile, GM Chief Executive Mary Barra said the automaker will create a global organization that'll focus on product safety and quality. This is Mary Barra speaking in New York earlier this month.
This new way of developing vehicles will provide the highest levels of safety, quality, and customer service and ensure that a situation like the ignition switch recall doesn't happen again.
That's GM CEO Mary Barra, the new CEO of GM. Ralph Nader, the old, the new, what does this mean?
Well, as a long-time unpaid consultant to General Motors, I would advise Mary Barra, first of all, to reopen all these product liability suits by the bereaved families before the bankruptcy and after the bankruptcy. You've got people who want their day in court. They want a trial by jury. They want to bring General Motors to compensate them for their horrendous losses before their jury peers. And GM is resisting reopening these pre-bankruptcy cases. And here's another example of convergence. When it comes to having your day in court, if your loved one was killed or seriously injured in a defective GM car, it doesn't matter whether you call yourself Republican or Democrat or liberal or conservative. You want your day in court. When we get down to where people live, work, and raise their children, these manipulative ideologies that are controlled by the plutocracy, both from Wall Street to Washington, tend to dissipate as people focus on simple fair play, simple golden rule, simple justice. And GM better realize that this imbroglio that they've gotten themselves into is only going to get worse. The press is competitively covering it. They're looking for media prizes on it. It's not going to stop. More is going to spill out of the impenetrable bureaucratic bungling of GM with other car models beyond the 2.6 million vehicles they're recalling for the faulty ignition switch situation. Mary Barra has already suspended 2 project engineers with pay. So obviously she's conducting an internal investigation. The only way really this is going to be prevented in the future is not only for tougher regulation, stronger legislation in Congress, better budgets for the Department of Transportation to enforce the safety laws, stronger safety standards, stronger reporting standards so that the auto companies, not just GM, are required under heavy penalty to report immediately evidence of vehicle technical defects on the highway. But it's also going to require protection of whistleblowers inside GM through an independent ombudsman, which I hope that she will